Let me tell you about the moment I held someone's entire future in my hands and chose to be more cruel than any of them ever imagined I could be. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The casting room smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and old coffee, the way every casting room smells in every city in America. I was sitting at the far end of a long table, my jacket folded neatly over the back of my chair, a bottle of still water in front of me that I hadn't touched. Joanna, my assistant, was to my left with a clipboard. There were 3 other producers in the room, none of whom knew what I was about to do. There was a camera running in the corner, fluorescent lights, the usual quiet before the work begins. The door opened, and he walked in. Keith Holloway. I had not seen his face in over 15 years. The hair was different, thinner now, worked over carefully to cover a retreating hairline. He was wearing a blazer that was slightly too expensive for someone whose finances were in the condition mine were known to be in. He smiled at the room the way people smile when they're afraid, which is to say too widely and for half a second too long. He handed his headshot to Joanna. He didn't look at me directly because in his mind, I was nobody he had ever met before. But I knew the precise texture of that face. I had spent years watching it receive things that were meant for me. I kept my expression completely neutral. He cleared his throat, introduced himself the way actors do. Name, representation, a brief, self-deprecating reference to a recent project that hadn't gone well. A practiced humility that was supposed to make us like him. I had seen it 1,000 times. I let him talk. I watched his hands, which were slightly unsteady. I watched his jaw, which he held tight the way people hold things when they are frightened but need to appear confident. Then I nodded at Joanna, and she told him to begin. He performed. I'll give him this. Even 15 years later, even broken down and desperate, there was something genuine in him when he was in a scene. I can admit that now. But what I was watching, what I was really watching, had nothing to do with the scene. I was watching a man who had never once, in his entire life, understood the difference between what he had earned and what he had taken, and I was watching him perform a scene about betrayal with the complete sincerity of someone who has never had to live with the consequences of their own. When he finished, the room was quiet, and I said the words I had not planned to say, but somehow knew I was always going to say. Interesting. You play this scene as if you've never betrayed anyone in your life. I want to take you back. I want to take you all the way back to where this story actually begins, because nothing I just described makes any sense without what came before it. And what came before it started not in a casting room with fluorescent lights, but in a high school auditorium in a mid-sized American city that most people outside that state have never heard of and will never need to hear of. I need to tell you who I was before any of this happened, because who I was is the only reason any of it mattered. I was the kid who stayed after school, not because I was in trouble, not because I had detention, not because I didn't have anywhere else to go, though that last one was closer to the truth than I ever admitted back then. I stayed after school because the auditorium was empty, and when the auditorium was empty, it was mine. Every seat, every row, the whole long rectangle of dark and quiet was mine, and I could stand on that stage and be the exact size I needed to be, rather than the small, strange, difficult to categorize size I was everywhere else. My name doesn't matter for this story. I'm going to be the person telling it, and that's enough. What matters is the auditorium, and what I did there, and what it meant to me. I started doing this when I was 14. There was a drama elective that I took mostly because I needed an arts credit, and I had no interest in ceramics or choir. Mr. Fletcher, Dennis Fletcher, who had been teaching English and drama at that school for what seemed like 200 years and probably felt like 200 years to him. He put me in a small scene with 2 other kids during the second week of class. It was a nothing scene from a nothing play, 3 pages, nothing at stake. But I remember standing under those stage lights for the first time and feeling something shift inside me, the way tectonic plates shift, not violently, not with any noise, but with absolute permanence. Something that had been pressing against something else was suddenly in a different position, and it would never go back. After that class, I started staying. At first, I would just walk the stage after everyone else had gone home, getting used to the feeling of the boards under my feet, the way the space had a different acoustic quality from every position. Then I started reading monologues out loud. I would pick up anthologies from the school library, fat collections of scenes and monologues for students, the kind of books that are dog-eared and held together with rubber bands because every drama class in the country orders one copy and then 50 students use it for decades. And I would stand at the center of that stage and I would say the words out loud to the empty seats. Let me tell you something about performing to an empty house. Most people who have never done it assume that it's easier. No pressure, no eyes on you, no possibility of failure. But that's wrong. An empty house is the hardest audience there is, because in an empty house, there is no energy coming back at you. When there's an audience, even a bad one, even a restless or skeptical one, there is a circuit that forms. Energy goes out from the stage and comes back, transformed, and you feed on that transformation. But in an empty house, there is no circuit. There is only what you generate yourself. And if you can perform in an empty house, if you can find a reason to be true, in a scene when there is no one watching, then you have found something inside yourself that is purely yours and cannot be taken by anyone. I did not know any of that at 14. I just knew it felt important. I just knew that I could stay there for 3 hours, and it would feel like 30 minutes, and that I would walk home in the dark and the cold, thinking about the work in a way that nothing else made me think about anything. My home life was not complicated in any dramatic way. There was no abuse, no violence, no addiction. My parents were ordinary, decent people who had ordinary, decent expectations. My father, Carl, who sold commercial insurance and coached youth baseball on weekends, believed that a man built his life around practical skills. He wasn't dismissive of art exactly, he just genuinely could not understand why it would be a priority. He could understand paying to see a movie. He could understand watching a play if someone gave you tickets, but devoting your life to it, that was a level of impracticality that made him physically uncomfortable, the way some people are physically uncomfortable around heights. He didn't fight about it. He just said things like, "As long as you have a backup plan, with a regularity that let me know, clearly and without any anger, that he considered the main plan to be the backup plan's less serious friend." The house I grew up in was comfortable and orderly. Carl kept the lawn cut on a strict schedule. Sandra kept the calendar on the kitchen wall updated in 3 different ink colors: blue for work, red for family obligations, green for appointments. Dinner was at 6:30. Homework was done before television. Saturdays were for errands and youth baseball. Sundays were for church in the morning and a big meal in the early afternoon, and quiet in the rest of the hours. I was not unhappy there. I want to make that clear, because it matters for understanding what drove me to the auditorium, and why. Specifically, it was theater and not something else. I was not running away from something painful at home. I was running toward something that had no name yet. The house was fine, my parents were fine, the structure was fine. But inside that fine and orderly structure, there was a version of me that had no room to exist. A version that was too large in some ways, and too strange in others. A version that felt things too precisely and said them too directly, and was almost never thinking about what everyone else seemed to be thinking about, which was grades and sports and social positioning and the slow, comfortable drift toward being acceptable. I was not a troublemaker. I was quieter than that. I was the kid who got B's in everything except English, where I consistently pulled A's, and who was polite and unremarkable in most social contexts and went largely unnoticed by teachers because I caused no problems, but also made no particular impression. I had one close friend, Brian Sutton, who lived 2 streets over and whose mother was friends with mine, and we spent a lot of time together the way boys spend time together when they share proximity more than true affinity, which is to say we were companionable and easy with each other, but probably would not have chosen each other across greater distance. Brian was kind. He was also uninterested in anything that I cared about most, which is a small but persistent loneliness that I grew used to. My mother, Sandra, who worked in hospital administration and organized everything in her life the way hospital administrators organize everything, which is to say with a kind of meticulous and slightly joyless precision, wanted me to be a lawyer. She had wanted this since I was about 9 years old. I don't know exactly when or why she decided this, but it was established fact in our house the way the town's geography was established fact, and it was about as easy to argue with. She went to law school informational sessions on my behalf. She saved brochures. She asked family friends who were attorneys about what it was like. She was not cruel about it. She loved me. She just saw a different version of me when she looked at me, a version that wore a suit and carried a briefcase and had a mortgage and a golf membership, and that version was so vivid to her that the actual version, the kid who came home smelling like stage dust and spent 3 hours reading monologues out loud to nobody, was a kind of temporary condition, an adolescent phase that would eventually resolve itself into the correct form. I did not fight them on any of this directly. I was not a confrontational kid. I stored it instead, the way you store things when you don't have the language or the power to do anything else with them, and I went to the auditorium, and I worked. The auditorium was my argument, not to them. They didn't know its full dimensions, didn't understand what happened inside it, didn't know about the hours or the preparation or the specific growth that was occurring in that space 3 or 4 nights a week. The auditorium was my argument to myself. The proof that I was real and what I was building was real, and the version of myself that existed inside the work was not a phase. By sophomore year, I was genuinely good. Not good the way that gets described as natural talent by people who don't know what they're talking about. Good the way you get from real work, consistent, specific, disciplined work over hundreds of hours in a space where nobody is watching you and nobody is giving you credit. Mr. Fletcher noticed it. He started giving me larger roles in the department productions. He started spending extra time after rehearsals going through technique with me in the way that teachers sometimes do when they recognize something worth developing. He was not effusive about it. Dennis Fletcher was not an effusive person. He gave you his attention, which was more valuable than his praise, and his attention was pointed and specific and exact. Junior year, I played the lead in the spring production, a mid-century American drama, a family piece with a complicated father-son dynamic that required a range I hadn't fully tested yet. I prepared for 6 weeks, not 6 weeks of showing up to rehearsals and saying the lines. 6 weeks of obsessive, consuming preparation that included research into the period, research into the psychology, work on physicality and voice, private rehearsal in the empty auditorium 5 or 6 nights a week. I built the character from the ground up in a way that felt, for the first time, like a real construction rather than an approximation. The night of the performance, I stood in the wings, waiting for my entrance, and I was afraid in the specific way that means you are ready, not the paralyzed fear of unpreparedness, but the electric fear of a person about to attempt something that matters. It went well, better than well. There was a moment in the second act, a long monologue about failure and fathers, and what gets passed down between generations whether you want it to or not, where I found something in the stillness that I had never found before. The audience went completely quiet. Not politely quiet, not distracted but seated quiet, but the kind of quiet that is actually a form of attention, where every person in the room is holding something inside themselves that the story has activated. I felt it. I have felt it maybe a dozen times in my life since then, and each time it still registers in my chest the same way it did that night. Mr. Fletcher came backstage afterward. He looked at me for a moment before he said anything. Then he said, "You understand what this is for. Most people never do." I went home that night and lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling with a feeling I can only describe as certainty. Not happiness exactly, something more foundational than happiness. Certainty, the absolute, unqualified, bone-level knowledge that this was what I was supposed to be doing with my life, that this was the specific language that my specific mind and body were built to speak. I had never felt it about anything else. I have never, in all the years since, felt it about anything else. That summer I researched theater academies. There were several serious ones. Conservatories attached to major universities, standalone programs with national reputations, 3- and 4-year programs that produced working professionals with real careers. I wrote away for brochures. I made a list. I read about audition requirements. I started building a file of material. Monologues, scenes, contrasting pieces in different styles and periods. The way you build a portfolio. I told Mr. Fletcher about my plan, and he said he would write me a recommendation, and the way he said it communicated without ambiguity that it would be a strong one. By the beginning of senior year, I had identified the production I needed. Every year the school mounted one major production. Not the small departmental shows, not the one-act festivals, but a full-scale, fully produced, fully advertised community event that got reviewed in the local paper and attended by parents and community members, and crucially for my purposes, attended by educators and administrators from regional theater programs who sometimes came specifically to scout. The previous year's production had resulted in 2 students receiving strong recommendations to conservatory programs. The year before that, 1 student had been invited to audition directly for a summer intensive at a nationally recognized conservatory. This year's production was going to be a serious dramatic piece, a contemporary American play with a central male role that was, by any honest assessment, a career-making role for a high school actor, complex, demanding, psychologically layered, with a long arc that required sustained technical control and genuine emotional availability. I had spent the summer preparing it. By September, I had been working on it for 3 months. I knew the role the way I knew my own face in the mirror, the specific weight of every scene, the exact trajectory of the character's internal life, the moments where restraint was required, and the moments where release was required, and the precise distinction between them. I had talked to Mr. Fletcher about it, not directly saying, "Give me this role." That wasn't how it worked, but in the language of mutual understanding that had developed between us over 3 years of serious work. He knew what the production meant to me. He knew what I had prepared. He had seen me work. He told me to bring my full preparation to the audition and let the work speak, and the way he said it was the way someone says something when the outcome is, barring catastrophe, already understood. And then Keith Holloway arrived. It was the 3rd week of September. I was in the middle of a morning English class when the door opened and Mr. Fletcher came in with a new student, which was unusual because Mr. Fletcher didn't usually escort new students to class. That was normally handled by the office. But this student's arrival had apparently warranted a special introduction. He stood at the front of the room and smiled, and the room responded the way rooms respond to certain people immediately and without any logical basis. Everyone sat up slightly. Everyone became slightly more interested in what was about to happen. His name was Keith Holloway. He had transferred from a school in Connecticut. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the kind of easy physical confidence that some people are simply born with, and that others spend years of therapy trying to understand why they don't have it. He spoke well. He made a small, self-deprecating joke about the transfer that was genuinely funny and landed with the class in a way that suggested either natural charisma or an extremely well-calibrated performance. He sat down in a desk 2 rows ahead of mine, and the girl next to him was already leaning slightly in his direction before he'd settled into his seat. I noted all of this the way I noted most things, carefully, without expression, storing it for later assessment. I had no immediate reaction to him. New students arrived. People made an impression or didn't. I went back to listening to the class. But over the next 2 weeks, something began to develop that I did not have a name for at the time, but that I would name precisely later, the systematic displacement. It began subtly. Keith joined the drama department, which was not surprising. He'd apparently been involved in theater at his previous school. He was good, I could see that immediately, and I am not someone who withholds credit easily. He had instincts. He had stage presence in the basic physical sense, the ability to hold space, to be looked at without apology, to carry a scene's weight in his body. Whether he had anything deeper than that was harder to assess from the outside, especially in the early weeks of a semester when everyone is still finding their footing. What I noticed more than his talent, though, was the response to his talent. Teachers who had watched me work for 3 years treated his arrival like the arrival of something they had been waiting for. Terry Landry, the assistant drama teacher who handled the technical work and the junior productions, started talking about Keith in the hallway, in the cafeteria, in the way teachers talk about students when they want other students to hear. Real stage presence, Terry said to another teacher, within easy earshot of a cluster of students that included people who would repeat it. Natural talent, Terry said, and the phrase natural talent is a specific kind of cruelty when directed toward someone who has built everything they have, from 200 hours of solitary work in an empty room. The social dimension of Keith's arrival was also something I watched with a particular attention. He did not need to work at fitting in, because fitting in seemed to be something that the social architecture of the school did automatically for him. By the 3rd week, he was at the lunch table with the people who other people watched. By the 4th week, he was being invited to the parties I had never been invited to and had never wanted to be invited to, but whose existence and currency I understood precisely. He moved through the school the way certain people move through social spaces, effortlessly, as if the space had been arranged in advance to accommodate him, as if every door was already slightly open. I watched him, and I felt something that I did not want to call envy because I had a complicated relationship with envy and did not like to acknowledge it in myself. It was not envy of his social success. I genuinely did not want what he had there. It was something more precise. The recognition that he occupied a category of person for whom the systems around him automatically organized themselves in his favor, while I occupied a category of person for whom those same systems consistently organized against. He had not done anything to earn the responses he received. He had simply arrived pre-formatted for a world that rewarded a specific set of characteristics that he happened to possess, and that I, equally, happened not to. This became more concrete as October approached. Keith began spending time after school in the drama room, not in the auditorium, not doing the private work that I considered the real work, but in the drama room, the social center of the department, where the students who were involved in productions gathered and talked and built the interpersonal currency of a theatrical community. I had spent 3 years largely outside that social space because it had never seemed relevant to what I was actually doing, which was the work, but Keith was inside it immediately and naturally, and I watched the shift in the department's social gravity as his presence reorganized it. He spoke to me directly twice in the first month. Both times pleasantly, generically pleasantly, the way people are pleasant to people they have correctly assessed as non-threatening and unimportant to them. I was courteous in return. I did not perform warmth I didn't feel, but I did not perform coldness either. I was neutral, accessible, a known quantity that did not require further attention. And here's the thing I have thought about most in the intervening years, about those first weeks. I should have paid more attention to Brian. Brian, who I had known since childhood, who had been a peripheral presence in the drama department because I was there, who had struck up a friendship with Keith in the way that people who are looking for a new social arrangement will sometimes rapidly invest in whoever offers one. I noticed this happening but did not understand its significance. Brian and Keith were friendly. Brian knew my work. Brian had read the monologue. And I paid no attention to the intersection of those 3 facts because I had no reason to think that the intersection mattered. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that the production was what mattered, and that my preparation was real and documented and visible in the work itself, and that when auditions happened, the work would be its own argument. Auditions happened in the first week of October. I prepared for them the way I prepared for everything. Precisely, thoroughly, without shortcuts. I had 2 contrasting monologues ready, a prepared scene, and the full first act arc of the central role mapped out in my head in exact detail. I had done a practice run the night before in the auditorium alone, running the material 4 times through until I was satisfied not with perfection, but with something better than perfection, which is reliability, the knowledge that whatever happens in the room, whatever nervousness or disruption occurs, the work is in the body and will not abandon you. I went in. I did the work. It was good. I knew it was good in the specific, technical, non-arrogant way that you know something is good when you have enough experience to assess it without ego. When I finished, Mr. Fletcher made a note on his clipboard and gave me a nod. Not effusive, not congratulatory, just the nod of a person who has seen what they needed to see. Keith auditioned after me. I watched from the hallway through the small window in the auditorium door. He was good, genuinely good. He had clarity and physicality and a natural authority in the space. I watched him and felt, alongside the specific uncomfortable feeling of watching someone do your thing well, a clarity about the distinction between us. I had depth. He had surface. He had the immediate, readable, impressive surface that audiences and casual observers respond to, and I had the thing underneath that surface, the thing that takes 100 hours of empty auditoriums to build. Both are real. They are not the same thing. I went home that night, and I was not worried. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I was not complacent, but I was not worried. I had done the work. The work was real. It had been seen by someone who knew how to see it. The cast list went up 11 days later. I was not on it. Not in the lead role, not in any role. No, that's not accurate. I was on it. I was listed, in small print at the bottom, as an understudy. An understudy. Keith Holloway was the lead. I stood in front of that list in the hallway outside the drama room for what must have been 2 full minutes, reading it 3 times the way you read something that your brain refuses to process correctly, and so keeps starting over. Around me, the hallway moved with the normal traffic of a school day, people brushing past, conversations running into each other, the ordinary, unceasing noise of a building full of 1,000 people going about their ordinary concerns. I stood there reading the same list over and over. Then I folded it. I didn't fold the actual list. It was posted on the wall. I folded something inside myself, pressed it flat, and I went to my next class. I should have gone to Mr. Fletcher immediately. I should have asked, directly and honestly, what had happened and why. This is the strategic mistake I mentioned. The thing I did wrong. The decision that would cost me more than I understood at the time. Instead of having that conversation, instead of walking into that room and saying, with the full weight of 3 years of serious documented work, help me understand what happened here, I did the thing that people do when they are stunned and proud and still processing. I said nothing. I absorbed it. I showed up to rehearsals and did the understudy work without complaint and without conversation. I told myself this was discipline. I told myself that a real artist keeps working regardless of the circumstances, that complaining about casting was amateur and unbecoming, that the way to answer injustice was to be so unassailably good that it could not be ignored. I was wrong. Not about the discipline. The discipline was real and necessary, but about the silence. The silence was a mistake, because what I didn't do while I was being silent was find out what had actually happened. And what had actually happened was something that, had I known it, would have changed my entire strategy. I found out 3 weeks later. I was leaving the drama room after an after-school rehearsal, going down the side corridor toward the parking lot exit, and I heard voices from the small office, adjacent to the prop storage room, the room that Mr. Fletcher used as a secondary office for paperwork and budget planning. The door was partially open. The voices were Mr. Fletcher's and Keith Holloway's. I was not eavesdropping intentionally. I stopped because I heard my name. I won't reproduce the conversation exactly as I remember it, partly because memory is not a recording device, and partly because what was said is less important than what it meant. What was said, in summary, was this. Keith's parents, his father specifically, whose name I would later learn, was Russell Holloway, a wealthy businessman who had relocated his family from Connecticut for professional reasons, had recently made a significant donation to the school's theater department. Not a small donation, a significant one. New lighting equipment, reupholstered seats in the auditorium, a contribution toward the production budget that meant the scale of this year's show could be meaningfully larger than in previous years. And the expectation associated with this donation, the expectation that was never made explicit because the wealthy understand that things are more binding when left unstated, was that the donor's son would be at the center of what the donation had made possible. Mr. Fletcher, to be fair, was not enthusiastic about the arrangement. What I heard in his voice was the tone of a person who has been placed in a position they do not like by forces they cannot easily oppose. He was not a corrupt man. He was a tired man in a compromised position, which is a different thing and in some ways worse, because the tired man in the compromised position has already talked himself into what he's doing and doesn't need to talk himself out of it. Keith said something that I couldn't fully hear from the hallway, and then there was a silence. And then Fletcher said something about making sure the production is the best it can be, in the way that administrators say things about making sure the production is the best it can be when they mean something else entirely. I walked home that night in a cold I barely felt. I want to stop here and ask you something, because this is the moment that I've turned over in my mind more than any other in the last 15 years. If you were standing in that hallway and you had just heard what I'd heard, if you knew, with complete clarity, that the thing you'd spent years working toward had been given away, not because someone was better than you, but because someone's family had bought it, what would you do? I'm genuinely asking you this. Put in the comments what you would have done in my place, because what I did next is the thing I'm still not sure whether I was right about. What I did was nothing. I stayed as the understudy. I showed up to every rehearsal. I learned the role. Not just the understudy's minimal obligation, but the whole role. Every beat and transition and choice. Learned it better than Keith was performing it because I'd been living inside it for months before he ever auditioned. I watched Keith work and I saw his limitations and I saw the moments where a different kind of preparation would have produced something deeper, and I stored all of that. I performed the role alone in the auditorium at night after the building was supposed to be empty, and I began to see something that I hadn't seen before, or rather, I began to understand something that I had only peripherally perceived. The production was not just a school event. It had a budget this year, real money, which meant it had real production values, real lighting design, real costumes, real sound, and that meant it had external attention in a way that previous productions hadn't. The local paper sent someone. A regional arts organization sent a representative. And, according to Mr. Fletcher's announcement, at one of the production meetings there would be representatives from 2 regional theater conservatories in attendance at the premiere, which Keith was going to perform in the role I had spent a year preparing. I sat in a chair in the auditorium during one of the technical rehearsals, and I watched Keith blocking through a scene, and I felt, for the first time, the specific texture of helplessness that comes not from being unable to do something, but from being in a situation where your ability is simply not the variable that matters. I had the skill. The skill was not in question. The skill had been looked at, acknowledged, and set aside because the relevant variable was money that wasn't mine, and a donor relationship that had nothing to do with the stage. The premiere was a Friday night. I know this because I have never in my life been able to forget a single detail of that evening. The auditorium was fuller than I had ever seen it. Families, community members, press, the representatives from the conservatories who were seated in reserved chairs near the center of the house. The production looked extraordinary. The lighting was genuinely professional. The set design, funded by the Holloway donation, was the most ambitious the department had ever attempted. Keith was good that night. I am telling you this with no embellishment in either direction, He was genuinely, legitimately, on his best night good. There was a version of me watching from the wings. I was backstage in the understudy capacity, which meant I was present for every moment. They could have admired the performance on its own terms, but I was not able to watch it on its own terms, because what I was watching was not just a performance. I was watching someone perform a role that had been handed to them through a transaction that had nothing to do with the work, in front of the people I needed most to see what I could do. And I had no recourse, and no voice, and no ability to change a single thing about any of it. The applause was enormous. Standing ovation. The conservatory representatives were on their feet. Keith came out for his curtain call, and the theater filled with a sound that I had spent 3 years building toward hearing with my name attached to it. And instead I was behind a curtain in the dark, listening to it happen to someone else. I have never told anyone what the next 20 minutes were like. I sat on a prop crate backstage while the audience filed out, and the cast celebrated and people took photographs, and the sounds of success ran through the building. And I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, and I was completely still. Not performing stillness. Actually still. The way objects are still. There was something inside me that had been moving forward for 3 years. A current, a direction, a sense of building momentum, and it had simply stopped. Not broken, not destroyed, stopped. Like a clock that has been set down on a table and turned to face the wall. I went home and I did not perform in the auditorium that weekend. The conservatory applications went in over the following month. I applied to 4 programs. I prepared the required materials: headshots, a resume, recorded submissions, personal statements. I prepared my audition pieces with the same thoroughness I brought to everything. I went to 2 in-person auditions. I was rejected from everything. And then came the piece of information that made the rejections make sense in a way that was almost worse than just being rejected. A classmate told me, casually, in the cafeteria, the way people tell you things in high school when they don't understand that they are destroying something. Keith Holloway had been accepted to the most prestigious conservatory program he'd applied to. I nodded and said something neutral. The classmate moved on. I looked at my lunch tray. Then I found out, through a different channel, what he had used for his audition. He had used a monologue, a specific monologue, a piece I would know the exact shape of in the dark because I had written it myself. I want to be careful about explaining what this was. I had been writing monologues for 2 years, personal creative work, exploratory pieces, material that had no formal home, but that I used in private practice because writing my own material forced a different kind of engagement with the craft than performing existing pieces. I'd shared this particular monologue with 2 people. Mr. Fletcher, as an example of my writing work, and a student I had considered a friend, Brian Sutton, who had sometimes stayed after school with me, who knew my work, who had been in the same productions, who had conversations with Keith Holloway that I had not thought to be worried about. The monologue was not exactly mine in any legal sense. It wasn't published. I hadn't formally registered it. It was a piece of writing by a 17-year-old that existed in a notebook and had been shared informally, but it was mine in the only way that actually mattered to me. It had come from the inside of me. It was built from specific experiences and specific language that came from nowhere else, and it had been taken and used and had opened a door that should have been mine to walk through. When I say the most painful moment came later, this is what I mean. The rejection I could have lived with. The money and the sponsorship and the politics. Those were a brutal education in how the world works, but they were not personal. They were systemic. But this, taking the specific work that came from the deepest part of what I was, using it as a key, walking through the door it opened, and never once acknowledging where it came from. This was a particular kind of theft that stripped away any possibility of telling myself the situation had just been bad luck or bad politics. This was someone looking directly at what I had and deciding it was theirs. I left that city 3 weeks after graduation. I did not tell anyone I was going. I did not have a farewell gathering. My parents, to their credit, did not try to stop me. By that point, the silence between us on the subject of my future had developed into a mutual unspoken agreement that I needed to go do something, even if none of us could name clearly what it was. My mother gave me a check that covered 2 months of modest rent and told me to call when I was settled. My father shook my hand at the door and said, "Keep your head down and work hard," and meant it completely sincerely, which is the most my father knew how to do, and I was grateful for it. I got in my car, a used Civic with 180,000 miles on it, and a passenger side window that didn't fully close, and I drove to a city large enough that a person could disappear into it completely, which was what I needed. To disappear, to become invisible and anonymous, and start from nothing in a place where nothing I had done before was known or remembered or attached to me. The first years were, and I'm going to be direct about this because I think the word that is usually used is too soft. They were grinding. Not colorful grinding. Not struggle montage in a coming-of-age film grinding. They were the slow, unglamorous, structurally repetitive grind of a person who has chosen something difficult and is discovering that difficulty is not inspirational, it is just difficult. I lived in a studio apartment on the 4th floor of a building with a broken elevator that I shared, in the sense that the building shared all its noise and smells and plumbing problems among its tenants, with a collection of people who were all in some form of transition. Students, recent graduates, a woman named Wendy who was a night shift nurse and slept days, and whom I heard moving through her apartment above mine, like the specific ghost of someone exhausted, a young man who played guitar until 11, and stopped precisely at 11 every night because he had apparently calculated the exact moment before noise complaints would be filed. I ate cheaply, I slept badly, I worked the restaurant job. The open auditions were a different education from anything I'd expected. Not because they were discouraging. I had prepared myself for discouragement and was well equipped for it, but because of what they revealed about the specific material reality of a performing career at the entry level, which was nothing like what it appeared from the outside, and nothing like what drama classes and theater productions and the internal mythology of artistic vocations suggested it would be. What it actually was, in the early years, was administrative. It was tracking calls. It was maintaining a headshot that needed to be updated every 18 months. It was understanding which agencies would look at which submissions and which wouldn't, which casting directors had specific preferences, which venues produced, which kinds of work, which rehearsal, periods conflicted with which other rehearsal periods, how to do the math on whether a paid role at a small venue was worth taking if the transportation costs and the time investment against your primary income were factored in honestly. I was bad at this initially. I had come from a world where the work was the only variable, where you prepared, you showed up, you performed, and the quality of the work determined the outcome. That model works when you are in a school production, run by a teacher who knows you and has watched you develop. It does not work in an industry where you are one of thousands of qualified people competing for a finite number of opportunities, and where the variables that determine outcomes include things like relationships, timing, physical type, the specific aesthetic preferences of the decision maker on a given day, and dozens of other factors that have nothing to do with the quality of the work. I spent the first year being naive about this, and the second year being bitter about it, and the third year beginning, very slowly, to understand it in a way that was actually useful. Understanding it meant accepting that the rules of the game were not the rules I had assumed, and then developing a strategy that worked within the actual rules rather than the imagined ones. This is harder than it sounds. The imagined rules were the ones I had built my identity around. The actual rules required a complete reconception of what I was doing and why and how. The recognition that there was a business architecture underneath the artistic architecture was not a cynical discovery. I want to be careful about that framing. I was not disillusioned. I was educated. There is a difference. Disillusionment is what happens when you discover that the thing you loved is false. Education is what happens when you discover that the thing you loved is more complex than you understood. and that the complexity fully engaged with makes your relationship to it more powerful rather than less. I did not love the stage less when I understood the money. I loved it differently, with more accuracy. And accuracy, in the long run, is the thing that determines whether you can sustain something or only approach it and lose it. The restaurant work, paradoxically, was part of my education in a way I did not recognize until much later. Arthur Redford ran his operation with a kind of systematic intelligence that impressed me increasingly over time. He did not have formal business training. He had built his understanding of how businesses worked from direct experience over 30 years. And what he had built was not just knowledge but instinct, the ability to look at a situation and immediately identify the variable that mattered most. He also had no patience for sentimentality about his own preferences. He would change something that had worked for 10 years if he identified a reason the changed version would work better, without nostalgia and without drama. I watched this and absorbed it without knowing I was absorbing it, the way you absorb things when you are in close enough proximity to them and paying enough attention. I got a call back once a month on average, a booking once every 2 months, small roles, non-speaking roles, walk-ons, a regional theater production where I had a scene in the third act that ran 12 minutes and was genuinely good. The director told me afterwards that my work was intelligent, which from that director in that context meant something real, but that led nowhere because the production was small, and the run was short, and the audience was limited. I was not waiting for a break. I want to make this absolutely clear, because the concept of waiting for a break is something that people in the industry talk about in a way that I found, very quickly, to be a form of passivity that I was allergic to. I was not waiting for anything. I was learning. And what I was learning during the years of small roles and large restaurant shifts was something that turned out to be far more important to my future than any acting technique I could have studied. I was learning how productions worked, specifically who funded them, how budgets were structured, where the money came from and where it went, and who made the decisions that the talent assumed were made on purely artistic grounds. I learned this partly through proximity, working for Arthur Redford, who was not just a restaurateur but a community figure, who had his fingers in various local arts organizations. I found myself in conversations about venue rentals and ticket splits and production accounting that I absorbed with an intensity I had not originally anticipated, and partly I learned it through deliberate study. I started reading, not acting books. I had been reading those for years. I started reading business books, finance books, books about deal structure and investment and the specific mechanics of how creative industries actually functioned financially. I had no plan yet, but I had the instinct, sharp and clear and impossible to argue with, that the thing that had been done to me was ultimately a financial transaction, and that understanding the language of financial transactions was the thing that would eventually give me something I had not had at 17. Leverage. Arthur noticed the reading. He was that kind of employer, the kind who actually watches their staff, who sees things. He was in his early 60s, had built his restaurant group from a single location, had opinions about money and discipline that he shared without invitation, and that were, more often than not, correct. He started pulling me into conversations about his own business, the way a mentor does, not explicitly but through escalating inclusion. He would ask my opinion on a lease negotiation or a staffing decision, and then tell me where I was right and where I was wrong with the directness of someone who considers directness a form of respect. One day, about 3 years into my time at his restaurant, he told me that a small theater company across town, a legitimate off-something organization that had been around for decades and produced serious work with no money and a devoted but tiny audience, was going to close unless someone came in with capital. The building owner was calling the lease. The company's production budget was exhausted. The artistic director was a woman in her 70s named Rita, who had devoted 40 years to the organization and was facing the end of it with the specific grief of someone watching something they built outlive its sustainability. Arthur asked me if I thought it was worth saving. I said yes. He asked me why. I told him. Not in the language of artistic idealism, not because theater matters, and because communities need art. I told him in the language he spoke. I told him about the property values of the block, the tax incentives available for arts organizations in our city, the programming opportunities that would draw a demographic the neighborhood was actively trying to develop. I told him about the secondary economic activity generated by a functioning arts venue. I told him about the grant landscape for organizations of that type and the documentation requirements that, if managed properly, could fund a significant percentage of annual operating costs without reliance on box office. He looked at me for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this," he said. I had been thinking about it for 3 years. He put in the capital. He brought me in as the operational manager, not artistic director. That remained Rita's domain, which was correct, but administrative and financial manager with real authority over the organization's business structure. I was 23 years old. I worked 18-hour days for 14 months. I restructured the grant applications. I renegotiated the lease. I built a donor cultivation program from scratch. I brought in 3 corporate sponsors, whose relationships I developed personally over many months of patient, persistent professional cultivation. The theater didn't just survive, it began to grow. And in the process of making it grow, I developed something that no amount of audition preparation had ever given me: a reputation, not as a performer, as a person who could make things work, as someone who understood both sides of the stage, the artistic and the financial, with a fluency that most people in the industry have on one side or the other, but almost never both. This is an extremely rare thing, and it turned out to be extremely valuable. The theater community, at every level, is small. Cities that seem large contain industries that function like small towns. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows who did what. Everyone tracks who's rising and who's falling with the focused attention of a community that has limited resources and needs to know where competence lives. My name started circulating in that community, not loudly, not with fanfare, just the quiet movement of information among people who pay attention. There is a person at this organization who knows how to structure a production budget. There is a person who can talk to donors in a language that makes them feel like partners, rather than ATMs. There is a person who can read a contract and identify the provisions that will matter in 3 years. I got a call from a mid-sized regional theater that was putting together a production with real ambition and real resources, but was struggling to get the financial architecture right. I took a meeting, then another meeting. Then I structured a deal for them, a co-production arrangement with a venue in another city that split costs in a way that made the scale of the production possible. And the production happened, and it was good, and it did well, and my phone started ringing more. I am telescoping years here. I want you to understand that. What I'm describing as a smooth upward progression was in reality a decade of incremental, slow, frustrating movement that involved countless mistakes and setbacks and periods of doubt that I am not going to dramatize for you, because they were not dramatic. They were just the gray, relentless experience of building something in small increments over a long time. I made bad deals. I trusted the wrong people twice. I lost money on a production I should never have backed. A large-scale musical by a first-time composer that I had convinced myself was a risk worth taking, and which was indeed a risk, but not the kind that paid off, and which cost me both money and the relationship with one of my early investors, a cautious man named Douglas Pritchard, who had backed 2 of my previous projects, and who, after the musical, declined to return my calls for 8 months. I had a year where I genuinely considered whether I was in the right business, whether the whole trajectory had been built on an obsession that was really just a wound dressed up as a vocation. During that year, I took almost no new projects. I worked maintenance contracts, administrative consulting for organizations that already existed, solving their operational problems for a fee, keeping the lights on in my own operation without the ambition or the risk of originating something new. I told myself this was strategic. a consolidation period, rebuilding the foundation before the next construction phase. Some of this was true, and some of it was an elaborate justification for the fact that I was, for the first time since leaving my hometown, genuinely uncertain about whether I should continue. What got me through it was not inspiration, not a moment of clarity or a conversation that reframed everything, or a project that reignited my purpose. What got me through it was stubbornness, the specific, unspectacular, deeply unsexy stubbornness of a person who cannot find a convincing reason to stop. I had no other version of my life that was compelling enough to trade for this one. Even at its most doubtful, even in the year of maintenance contracts and unanswered investor calls, the path I was on was more mine than any alternative I could imagine. So I kept going. I kept going the same way you keep walking in the same direction when you can't see where you're going, but you're fairly certain that stopping is worse. The turnaround, when it came, did not come all at once. It came through a series of small, successful decisions that rebuilt the pattern of confidence that bad decisions erode. A production I backed with a small budget that overperformed. A partnership with a playwright, not Carla yet, that was later, who became a modest critical success and whose acknowledgement in the program of my support was seen by the right people at the right time. A restructuring deal for a venue that was in financial trouble, which I completed under budget and which the venue's board talked about with their peers in the way that boards talk about useful service providers when they are impressed. And slowly, through the accumulation of these decisions, the reputation rebuilt. The calls came back. Douglas Pritchard sent me a brief, professional note, acknowledging my recent work and suggesting a meeting, which was the most he would offer as an apology and which I accepted as sufficient. I want to explain something about what reputation actually is in a small industry, because I think people who are outside industries misunderstand it. Reputation is not what people say about you. It is not reviews or references or the things that appear in print. Those are symptoms of reputation. Reputation itself is something more intimate and more powerful. It is the pattern of behavior that people have observed, and their assessment of how that pattern will continue. When people in my industry said my name in rooms I wasn't in, they were describing a pattern. Someone who finishes what he starts. Someone who reads contracts and means what the contract says. Someone who does not overpromise on timelines or budgets. Someone who, when things go wrong, addresses them directly rather than through narrative management. This pattern, built over 10 years of small decisions that no one individually would have called significant, was the real architecture of what I had become, not the title, not the office, the pattern. By the time I was 32, I was a genuine producer, not a vanity title, not a courtesy credit. A producer whose name on a project told the relevant people in the relevant rooms that the project had been assessed and had financial backing and was going to happen. I had an office in a part of the city where office space meant something, not ostentatiously but meaningfully, in the way that geography communicates credibility in industries where physical presence matters. I had a small team, Joanna Maddox, as my development coordinator, 2 other staff members. I had relationships with a network of directors and playwrights and venues that I had built over 10 years of careful, patient, professional relationship tending. I had produced 8 productions, 3 of which had moved to larger venues, and 1 of which had been recognized with a significant industry award. The award was for a production about grief, a quiet, devastating 2-person piece by a young playwright named Paula Oakes, whose first work it was, and who had been unable to get any producer interested in it for 3 years before she found her way to my office through a referral. I had read it in 1 sitting and backed it within a week. It ran for 6 months, was extended twice, won the award, and launched Paula's career in the way that early work occasionally launches careers when the timing and the quality and the attention align. Paula sent me a handwritten note after the award announcement. She said she had begun to believe before our conversation that the piece would never be made, that there was no one willing to back work that was quiet and difficult and ask things of its audience. I kept the note. It was, in the ledger of things that mattered about the work, one of the items on the correct side, the side that justified the decade and the bad deals and the maintenance year and the very old tiredness, the side that said, the work is real and you built something that let it exist. I had also, over those years, built a specific kind of power that I had come to think of as the quietest and most durable kind, the power to say no, not to be refused. Anyone can be refused. To refuse. To be in a position where people came to me and I decided, with full information and without external pressure, whether to say yes or say no. This is the asymmetry that matters. On one side of that table is the person who needs something. On the other side is the person who decides. I had spent my whole early life on the wrong side. I had changed sides so slowly and so deliberately that there was no single moment I could point to and say, this is when it changed. It had just, over 10 years of relentless incremental work, changed. I had not forgotten Keith Holloway. I want to be precise about this too. I had not spent 10 years obsessing. I had not spent 10 years in anger, running an internal monologue about injustice and plotting revenge in the theatrical sense. That's not what this was. What I had was a specific, accurate, detailed memory stored in a specific, accurate, detailed place in my mind, the way you store information that you know will eventually be relevant. Keith's face, the casting list, the curtain I sat behind, the monologue, the door he walked through with my key. These things were in me not as wounds, but as data. They were part of what I knew about how the world worked and what it could do to a person who was not positioned correctly, and they informed, in ways both direct and indirect, every decision I had made since. I had kept track of him, not obsessively, not constantly, but the industry is small enough that information arrives without being sought, and what arrived over the years was not a story of simple success. Keith had gotten into the conservatory. He had graduated. He had gotten work, real work, decent work, the kind of work that would have satisfied almost anyone who wasn't chasing something very specific. A consistent career as a character actor in regional theater, some television, 2 film appearances that were reviewed respectfully. He had a manager, a decent reputation, a working actor's life. And then it had started to go sideways. There was a film, a moderately budgeted independent piece, that he had been attached to as a lead that fell through due to financing issues. And in the falling through, something about his behavior on set in the pre-production period had become known in a way that damaged his reputation with the specific people who make casting decisions. Then there was a theater piece that was badly reviewed and in which his performance was singled out for criticism in a way that stuck. Then there was some kind of personal situation. I heard different versions, and I am not in the business of spreading versions I can't confirm, that resulted in a public incident, small but noted, of the kind that in the current environment tends to follow a person for longer than it used to. By the time he walked into my casting room, his career had the texture of a building that looks structurally intact from the outside, but has compromised foundations. The projects that came to him were smaller. The representation that called on his behalf was less prestigious. He needed a strong role, a real, substantial, prestigious role, the way someone who has been in water too long needs solid ground, not to revive a flagging ambition, to survive. I'd known he would come, not in a mystical way, in the way that industries are structured, in the way that trajectories intersect when the same pool of people are all moving through the same geography of projects and opportunities. I had known for 2 or 3 years that it was a matter of time, and I had not prepared for it in the sense of plotting. I had simply continued to work, continued to develop the project I was developing, and the project I was developing was, as these things sometimes are, exactly the project that a person in Keith's specific position would most desperately want. The play was called, in the working draft, Other People's Words. It was a new work by a playwright I had been developing for 2 years, Carla Jennings, whose voice was extraordinary and whose understanding of the specific psychology of performance was the most precise I had ever encountered in a writer. The play was about an actor who has built an entire career on performances that were, in various ways, borrowed, stolen, or appropriated from other people's creative lives. Not through the kind of dramatic plagiarism that makes good movie plots, but through the quieter, more common, more devastating kind of theft that happens when a talented person learns to inhabit other people's interiority without ever developing their own. The central character performs brilliantly. He is recognized and praised, he wins things. And then, at a particular moment in his life, standing at the edge of what should be his greatest success, he becomes unable to perform at all, because performing requires finding something real inside yourself to offer, and he has spent so long taking from others that he cannot locate anything that is genuinely his. It was a devastating piece of work. It was also, in the landscape of American dramatic writing at that moment, exactly the kind of serious, ambitious, important new work that critics would receive with the attention it deserved. It was the kind of role that rebuilds reputations. It was the kind of role that, if performed with genuine commitment and craft, would open doors that had been closed. And embedded in the third act, in the central speech of the play, the moment where the character confronts what he has done with his life, was a monologue. I had given Carla a piece of writing to use as a structural reference point when she was developing the character's voice, a piece of writing from my own notebooks, a monologue I had written at 17 in an empty auditorium in a mid-sized American city, that I had shared with exactly 2 people, and that had been used by one of them to open a door that was mine. Carla had read it and built from it and around it. The final version was hers, shaped by her craft, embedded in the architecture of her play, but the skeleton of the thing, the specific emotional truth at its center, the original turn of phrase that gave the whole monologue its particular texture, that was mine. It had always been mine, and every night that an actor performed that play, they would stand at the center of that stage and deliver that monologue. My words, the words that had been taken from me. I want to ask you something else right now, because I've been sitting with this for a long time and I still don't have a fully clean answer. The setup I'm describing, bringing in the person who stole from you, offering them the role that requires them to perform the words they stole, in a play about a person who lives on stolen words, was that justice or was that cruelty? I'm not being rhetorical. I genuinely don't know. Put in the comments what you think, because the line between those two things is something I've been trying to find for 15 years, and I'm still not sure I found it. The audition was on a Tuesday. I had not told Joanna anything. I had not told anyone on my staff what the history was. The casting call had gone out through normal channels, and Keith's representation had responded, and the appointment had been made, and it appeared on my schedule the way any appointment appears on any schedule. A name, a time, a room. He came in. He was wearing the too expensive blazer. He had the practiced smile. He introduced himself with the self-deprecating reference to the recent project. I watched all of it from behind the neutral face I had spent years learning to wear, and what I felt, and this surprised me, still surprises me when I examine it honestly, was not triumph, not satisfaction, not the rush of arriving at a moment you've been moving toward for a long time. What I felt was something closer to tiredness, a very old tiredness, the tiredness of having carried something for a very long time and being close now to being able to put it down. I let him audition. He performed a scene, one of the secondary scenes from the play, the one the casting breakdown described as the audition material. He was good. I've already said this and I will say it again because it is true, and I am not interested in diminishing it. He was good. The years and the failures and the difficulties had given him something that success hadn't, a specific gravity, a weight in the quieter moments that he hadn't had at 18. He had suffered enough to access something real. The irony of this is not lost on me. When he finished, the room was quiet. I let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. Interesting, I said. You play this scene as if you've never betrayed anyone in your life. He frowned, not with the recognition of someone who knows what is happening, but with the confusion of someone who has received a note that doesn't parse. "I'm sorry?" "The character," I said, "is a man who has built everything he has on a foundation of other people's contributions. The scene works when you play it from inside that knowledge, from inside the specific quality of guilt that is carried by someone who knows very precisely what they've taken and can't give back." I paused. "You're playing it as if the character doesn't know." He nodded slowly. "I can go again if you want to see a different reading." "That's all right." I opened the folder in front of me. Inside was a script, the full script of the play, and tucked inside the script, visible when I opened the cover, was an old composition notebook. Not the same physical notebook I had carried in high school, but the same format, the same kind, and on the open page, in handwriting that was mine, the monologue. I had placed it there deliberately. I am not going to pretend otherwise. He looked at it. His eyes tracked to the handwriting. Something moved in his face. Not yet recognition, but the anterior feeling of recognition. The sense that a pattern is forming that hasn't completed itself yet. "This is the play you'd be performing, Gupapir," I said. "The central role." I slid the script across the table toward him. He reached for it, and as he picked it up, the notebook was fully visible. He looked at the handwriting again, longer this time, and I watched the moment it arrived. It arrived slowly, the way large things often do, not as a flash, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual accumulation of recognition that changed his expression by degrees. The handwriting, the specific phrasing on the visible page, the fact that he was sitting across a casting table from a producer he'd never met, who had inexplicably challenged him on guilt and taken things and foundations. The pieces assembled in real time, and I watched them assemble, and I did not say anything. He looked up from the notebook. For the first time since walking into the room, he looked at me. Not at my face as a surface to present to. Looked at me. "I know you," he said, not a question. The beginning of understanding. "We went to high school together," I said. "You were the lead in the senior production, I was the understudy." The silence that followed had a texture I cannot fully describe. It was the silence of someone trying to determine what is happening and what is about to happen, and whether the distance between those two things is navigable. I watched him calibrate, watched him consider options, watched him arrive, with the particular intelligence of a man who has been in enough difficult situations to read them accurately, at the understanding that he was not in a position from which any of the usual moves would help him. "I didn't," he started. "I'm offering you the role," I said. He stopped. "I want to be clear about what the role is," I continued. "It's the lead in a new play by one of the most important playwrights working in America right now. It will be reviewed seriously. It will be seen by the people who matter. It has every chance of being the thing that changes the current trajectory of your career." I let that land. The role is a man who has lived his entire life performing words written by someone else, because he never developed any of his own. The room was very quiet. "And the central monologue of the play," I said, "is a piece of writing that you will recognize." He looked at the notebook again, then back at me. "I want you to understand something," I said, and I kept my voice completely level and without any effect, because affect would have been the wrong instrument here. What I was doing required precision, not emotion. I'm not offering you this role as a punishment. I'm offering you this role because you are right for it. Because you have the specific experience of living inside borrowed materials that will let you perform this character with a truth that very few actors could bring to it. The things that happened, the choices that were made, put you in a position to do this work better than almost anyone. I folded my hands on the table. The question is whether you're honest enough with yourself to do it. He sat very still. "If I take this role," he said carefully, "what exactly is being asked of me? Nothing that isn't in the script. And he indicated the notebook. "The playwright had access to various source materials," I said. "The monologue in its current form is hers." Another silence, longer. "Why?" he asked, not combatively, genuinely. The question of someone who is trying to understand the shape of the thing that has been placed in front of them. I thought about this for a moment. The true answer was complex, and I had spent more time with it than I would ever be able to fully explain in a conversation. Because the play needs to be performed, I said. And you are the person who can perform it. This was true. It was also not the complete answer. The complete answer included things that were too intimate and too precisely shaped to offer across a casting table to a man I had last seen receiving applause I had earned. The complete answer had to do with what I had understood, slowly and at great cost over 15 years, about the nature of what he had done, and what it had done to me. It was not clean. It did not resolve into a lesson or a moral or a conclusion. It just was what it was, which was the most honest thing I could offer. He took the script. He didn't sign anything that day. He took the script and said he needed to read it, and that his representation would be in touch. He stood up and gathered his things and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the door, and he turned and he looked at me one more time with the expression of someone who has understood that they are standing in front of something irreversible. "I'm sorry," he said. I looked at him. I did not say anything. He left. The room was quiet for a long moment after the door closed. The other producers at the table exchanged glances. George Talbot, who had collaborated with me on 3 previous productions, and who had long since stopped trying to fully interpret the way I ran rooms, made a quiet note on his legal pad without commenting. Joanna set her clipboard carefully on the table surface and looked at her hands. Nobody said anything. I had, over the years, built a working environment in which the people around me understood that certain things would be explained when I chose to explain them and not before, and that the best response to a moment that did not parse immediately was patience. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and said we would reconvene Thursday with the remaining candidates. I drove home in the early evening through traffic that moved slowly, and I did not turn on the radio. I sat in my apartment, 3 rooms, good light, 7th floor, a building and a neighborhood I had chosen with the same deliberateness I brought to every structural decision, and I sat in a chair by the window as the sky went from gray to dark. The city made its evening sounds below me. I was not dramatic about it. I simply sat and let the day's full weight be felt, which is something I had learned to do rather than avoid, because the things you avoid always cost more in the end than the things you face. I had waited, technically speaking, for a version of this moment for 15 years. And what I found, sitting in the dark with the evening traffic 7 floors below, and the document on my desk that would become Keith Holloway's contract, was that the waiting had not been about this moment. The waiting had been about the work, the decade of building and failing and rebuilding, and the specific, relentless, unsexy discipline of making something real out of nothing. All of that had not been oriented toward a casting room on a Tuesday afternoon. It had been oriented toward a body of work, and the casting room had been one consequence of the work, a natural consequence, gravity, not engineering. Joanna came in 3 minutes after he left with the next appointment's materials. She asked me how it went. I said it went fine. She made a note on her clipboard. The afternoon continued. His representation called the following week. He accepted the role. Rehearsals began on a Monday in January. I attended the first read-through, which is not my standard practice. I am in the office, not the rehearsal room, as a rule, but I attended this one. I sat in the back of the rehearsal space in a folding chair with a cup of coffee that I didn't drink, and I listened to the entire play read aloud by the cast for the first time. When he reached the monologue in the 3rd act, he stopped before beginning it and held the page for a moment with a specific quality of stillness that I recognized. The stillness of someone finding their footing inside something that is true and therefore difficult. Then he began. He performed it. The words that had come from inside me at 17, that had been carried out of an auditorium in a notebook that wasn't his, that had opened a door and made a career and been buried under years of other materials and other performances. He performed them with a precision and a weight and a specific quality of genuine reckoning that made the room completely quiet. The director, Dennis Redford, no relation to my old teacher, a serious and experienced director who knew good work when she heard it, sat forward in her chair during the monologue and didn't move until it was over. I sat in the back of the room and felt the tiredness I'd mentioned before. The very old tiredness. It did not resolve into relief. It did not resolve into triumph. It settled into something closer to completion, in the way that a mathematical proof is complete. Not satisfying in an emotional sense, but correct, closed. The final statement following from everything that preceded it with a logic that cannot be argued with. The play opened in March. The reviews were extraordinary. Not just good. The kind of extraordinary that happens once or twice in a season and that people in the industry talk about with a specific reverence. The main critic in the city's most important paper used the word necessary. A national arts publication picked it up in their coverage of the season. The playwright was named in conversations about the most significant new American dramatic writing in years, and Keith's performance was singled out, repeatedly, with the specific language of someone who has found the deepest truth in a piece of work and performed it without protection. One reviewer wrote that watching him in the monologue was the experience of watching someone recognize themselves in a mirror they've spent a lifetime avoiding. The critic did not know how precisely correct that description was. His phone started ringing in a way it hadn't rung for years. I watched all of this from the position I had occupied for 15 years, behind the production, in the structures and finances and decisions that make things possible, invisible to audiences, invisible to most of the press, visible only to the specific people in the specific rooms where what I did was understood. The production was mine in every sense that mattered, and in none of the senses that put names on marquees. I want to tell you about a conversation I had during the run. He came to the office, not through his representation, not through channels, directly in person on an afternoon between matinee and evening performances. He sat across from me at my desk and he talked for a while, about the production, about the work, about what the role had required of him. And then he talked, haltingly, and without the practiced smoothness I had watched him deploy in every professional context I'd observed him in, about what he understood now about what had happened in high school, about the sponsorship, about the monologue, about the specific quality of casualness with which he had taken things, because his life had been structured in a way that made taking things feel like the natural order rather than a choice. He said he was sorry. He said it in the way people say it when they mean it rather than when they're performing meaning it, and I know the difference because I have spent my life being able to tell the difference. I listened. I let him finish. Then I looked at him for a moment with the same neutral expression I had worn at the casting table. "Thank you for saying that," I said. And then I went back to the papers on my desk, because here is the thing that took me 15 years and more private auditorium sessions than I can count to understand. It was never about him. He was the instrument of the injustice, not the source of it. The source was a system that prices access over merit and connection over craft, that allows money to override quality and parentage to override preparation. Keith was 20 years old and had been given everything his whole life and took one more thing in a context where taking was how everything around him worked. That doesn't make it right. It doesn't change what it cost me. But it means that closing the account with Keith was never going to be the thing that completed what I needed to complete. What completed it was the production. Not because the production was revenge. Because the production was good. Because Carla's play was a necessary piece of work, and I had helped make it possible. And the words at its center were the words I had written at 17 in an empty auditorium in front of empty seats. And they had reached an audience that felt them and understood them and was changed, even slightly, even temporarily, by the experience of encountering them. That was mine, not the credit, not the marquee. The actual fact of the work existing in the world and doing what real work does, which is make people slightly more honest with themselves about what they are. I walked out of the theater one night during the run. Not a specific night, just a Wednesday, a full house, nothing ceremonial about it, and stood on the sidewalk in the cold for a few minutes before getting into my car. The theater was lit. I could hear the muffled sound of the performance through the walls. My work, the building, the budget, the contracts, the relationships, the decade of preparation that had made the whole structure possible. Mine. I felt the tiredness. I also felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific sensation I had felt at 14, standing under stage lights in a school auditorium in front of an elective drama class, when something shifted inside me like tectonic plates, and nothing went back to the position it had been in before. Not happiness exactly. Something more foundational. And let me be honest with you about one more thing, because I have been honest about everything else, and this is the most important piece. The victory, if that is the right word, changed me. Not in the way that victories in movies change people, which is warmly and with some kind of return to wholeness. In the way that a very long journey changes the person who has made it permanently. The person who arrives is not the person who left, and the distance between them is too large to cross back, and the person who arrives is in some ways colder, and in some ways more effective, and in some ways simply not able to access things that the person who left still had. I think about the kid in the auditorium sometimes, the one who rehearsed monologues in front of empty seats, who felt, for the first time, the shift inside him when the lights came up. I recognize that person. I know what he wanted and why he wanted it, and how real it was. And I know that the person sitting behind the table in the casting room, the person with the office and the staff and the reputation and the leverage, is made entirely of that person's wanting, every choice built from that original material. But I cannot go back to being that person. I don't mean that as tragedy. I mean it as accuracy. This is the cost, not the years, not the loneliness of the long rebuilding period, or the strategic mistakes, or the nights of doubting whether the thing you're building is actually what you think it is. The cost is the specific, irreversible change that happens to a person who carries something very heavy for a very long time. You become shaped by the weight. And when the weight is finally put down, the shape remains. I put the weight down. The shape is what I am now. The production continued its run. Keith's career continued its reversal. Carla Jennings received the recognition she deserved. The play moved to a larger venue. My name, in the program, appeared where it had always appeared, in the small print near the back, with the other names of the people who make things possible before the lights come on. I've sat with the question of whether what I did to Keith was justice or cruelty for a long time now, offering him the role, the play about borrowed words, my monologue at the center. Some days it feels like justice, measured, cold, precise, proportionate to what was taken and in a form that could not be refused without cost. Other days it feels like something more complicated, a use of power that is different in degree, but not entirely in kind, from what was done to me at 17. The powerful person at the table, deciding. The young person's work being used, for purposes they did not fully choose. I have not resolved this. I am telling you that directly. I don't know if I should have done it differently, and I don't know if the person I've become is better or worse than the person who stood behind a curtain listening to applause he had earned and watching someone else take a bow. I only know that I chose the path that was mine, that I built what I built without shortcuts or violence or borrowed foundations, and that when the moment finally came and the door finally opened, what was on the other side was not peace. It was clarity. Clarity is not peace. It doesn't feel warm. It doesn't close anything. But it is extraordinarily, irreversibly honest. You see exactly what you are, and exactly what you built, and exactly what it cost. You see it without narrative, without justification, without the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about why we deserve what we have and why what we did was the right thing. Just the facts. Clean and cold and permanently available. I won. And I'll carry winning for the rest of my life the way I carried losing, precisely, accurately, in a specific place, available for whenever it becomes relevant. That's the honest end of the story. And I want to ask you one last thing before I go, because you've stayed with me through 15 years of this, and that means something. I told you what I did. I told you what it cost. I told you what I built and how and why. So now I want to know, if you had been where I was, if you had built everything from the inside of an empty room and had it taken and spent 15 years making it back, what would you have done when he walked through that door? What would the right thing have been? Put that in the comments, because I've been waiting a long time for someone to give me a better answer than the one I found.